A lifeline cut overnight. Imagine the biggest supply chain you've ever heard of. Not a single highway or port, but a ribbon of steel and sleeper ties stretching from cities in China all the way into the heart of Europe. Over the last decade, this network has carried more than 110,000 freight trains, linked 25 countries and 227 cities, and moved hundreds of billions of dollars in goods. Picture every one of those trains as a promise: parts for factories, electronics for stores, and dairy that must reach a shelf before it spoils. Now imagine that overnight, a key crossing on that route slams shut. Hundreds of trains are stopped in their tracks, tens of thousands of containers sit stacked at a border, and billions of dollars worth of goods don't arrive on time. That sudden cut is not an abstract headline. It's frozen factory schedules, unpaid workers, and food that can't be sold. For businesses and people on both sides of the route, the effects ripple fast. Why does one border closure matter so much? Because this rail network isn't a loose web. In places, it runs like a single choke point. When that choke point is closed, the whole system clogs. It's like a clogged artery in a body. The heart keeps pumping, but the flow stops where the blockage is. The result is immediate pain and a race to find another route before the damage spreads. In this video, we're going to do three things. First, rewind to how this China-Europe rail system grew into such a big deal. Second, walk through exactly what happened at the border and why Poland closed it. And third, follow how countries and companies scrambled to reroute trade and what that means for the future. But before we rewind, hold that image of the trains and the sudden stop. It's the problem that drives everything else. To understand why this railway matters so much, we have to rewind a couple of thousand years. Long before airplanes and cargo ships, the Silk Road was the main artery connecting China with Europe. Merchants carried silk, porcelain, spices, and stories across deserts and mountains, linking two continents through trade. It wasn't fast, it could take months, but it built relationships and wealth that shaped empires. Fast forward to the 21st century, and China set out to revive that ancient idea, not with camels and caravans, but with modern freight trains. In 2011, the very first China-Europe train rolled out from Chongqing, deep in western China, heading all the way to Duisburg, Germany. It was a bold test. Could a train really bridge Asia and Europe faster than ships and cheaper than air cargo? It worked, and that single route grew into something enormous. Just 2 years later, in 2013, China launched the Belt and Road Initiative, and the rail line became one of its most visible symbols. From that point, new tracks and logistics centers kept appearing like links in a growing chain. What started as one train route turned into an entire network of three main corridors: Eastern, Central, and Western, connecting 61 Chinese cities to over 220 cities in Europe. To picture the scale, imagine drawing hundreds of lines on a map between China and Europe. It would look like a giant spiderweb of steel. The longest route stretches nearly 14,000 kilometers, reaching all the way to Madrid, Spain, and a single trip takes about 20 days. That's less than half the time it takes by sea. Over the years, the numbers exploded. As of late 2024, the network had handled over 100,000 train trips, moved 11 million containers, and delivered goods worth more than $420 billion. Each of those containers carries something tangible: auto parts from Germany, electronics from China, machinery, chemicals, even baby formula. It's not just about trade, it's about two regions' economies being tightly woven together. And within this vast network, a few places became absolutely critical, hubs where everything connected. One of the most important of all? Poland. It's right in the middle of that map, where east meets west, and for years, it's been the gatekeeper for almost all trains traveling between China and the European Union. If you look at a map of the China-Europe rail network, Poland sits right where the lines narrow, a natural doorway between the east and the west. Almost every train traveling from China to Europe has to pass through it. In fact, roughly 90% of all China-Europe freight trains cross Polish territory, and almost all of them stop at a single hub, the Milosevice terminal. Think of it like the customs bottleneck of Eurasia, a huge switching yard where containers are unloaded, inspected, and transferred to European rail lines. Milosevice handles around 350,000 containers every year. The reason it's so crucial is that trains from China run on a different rail gauge, the width between the tracks, than European trains. So at this point, every container must be shifted onto new wagons before continuing west. Without that transfer, the cargo simply can't move forward. For Poland, this position turned into both an opportunity and a source of leverage. The country earns massive revenue from logistics, warehousing, and customs services tied to the railway. Towns near the hub grew around this trade, with new jobs in trucking, storage, and rail operations. The China-Europe line even opened up new export chances for Polish producers. Take Poland's dairy industry, for example. The country is one of the EU's top agricultural producers, famous for butter and cheese. Before the railway, shipping perishable goods to China was almost impossible. The trip by sea took too long, and air freight was too expensive. But with the train, travel time dropped to about 15 days. That meant Polish dairy could reach Chinese supermarkets fresh. Exports of these products to China jumped by nearly 80%, transforming small farmers into global suppliers. So for over a decade, Poland wasn't just a transit country. It was a key partner in the success of the entire Eurasian trade network. Trains carrying German auto parts, Chinese electronics, and Polish food products crisscrossed daily, turning central Poland into a heartbeat of global commerce. But when a country becomes the gateway for such a massive system, it also becomes a choke point. If that gate ever closes, everything behind it stops. And in late 2025, that's exactly what happened. It all began in early September 2025, an event that seemed small at first but quickly escalated into a major international disruption. Around September 10th, more than 20 Russian-made military drones, originally launched from Ukraine, reportedly drifted off course and entered Polish airspace. No one was killed and no serious damage was done. But for Poland, a country already on edge because of the war next door, it was a serious alarm. The Polish military reacted immediately, firing to intercept and drive the drones away. Only a few days later, Russia and Belarus made an announcement that sent even stronger shockwaves through Warsaw. The two allies would begin massive joint military exercises right along the Polish border, involving up to 100,000 troops and even nuclear strike simulations. For any country, that would sound threatening. For Poland, it felt like a direct provocation. Fearing for national security, Poland made a drastic move. It closed all road and rail crossings with Belarus. Officially, it was for the safety of citizens. But this single decision brought the entire China-Europe freight network to a standstill overnight. Here's why. Belarus sits directly between Russia and Poland. Nearly all trains coming from China pass through it before reaching Polish territory. So when the border was sealed, hundreds of trains were literally trapped on the Belarusian side, unable to move forward, unable to turn back. Within days, about 300 trains were stranded, carrying tens of thousands of containers filled with goods worth billions of dollars. Electronics, car parts, solar panels, and everyday consumer products were all stuck. It was as if someone had flipped the pause button on trade between China and Europe. Inside Poland, the effects hit fast. Logistics companies that depended on constant cargo flow found themselves paralyzed. Warehouses stood empty. Customs officials had nothing to clear. And on the Chinese side, exporters and manufacturers faced growing delays and penalties as their goods sat idle. The shutdown lasted more than 2 weeks, until September 25th, when Poland finally reopened the crossings. But by then, the damage had already been done. The disruption had exposed a harsh truth. Europe's most important rail link with Asia could be stopped by a single political decision. What's even more interesting, though, is that this wasn't just about drones or exercises. There were deeper motives behind Poland's choice, involving NATO, funding, and political strategy. On the surface, Poland's explanation sounded simple: national security. No country wants foreign drones crossing its skies or massive military drills happening right next door. But behind that reasoning was a far more complex political picture, one shaped by war, alliances, and money. Since the start of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Poland has been one of Ukraine's most important backers and a key logistical hub for Western military aid. The Polish city of Rzeszów, for example, has turned into what many call Ukraine's lifeline. Planes carrying weapons, ammunition, and humanitarian supplies from NATO countries all pass through there before heading east. This makes Poland both vital and vulnerable, a frontline state in every sense. Meanwhile, NATO has been steadily increasing its presence in Poland. More bases, more troops, more exercises, all designed to strengthen Europe's eastern flank. Around this time, Warsaw was also in talks with the European Union, requesting roughly 40 billion euros in defense funding to help fortify that same border region. Now, think about the timing. When Russia and Belarus announced their massive border exercises, Poland's leaders saw a chance, not just to show toughness, but also to reinforce their case for more military and financial support. By closing all crossings with Belarus, Poland sent a message: we take this threat seriously, and we're ready to act. It was a show of control and urgency, both to Moscow and to Brussels. But there was another layer, too: economic leverage. Poland knows exactly how important it is to the China-Europe trade route. When 90% of trains rely on your railways, you hold a powerful card. By cutting off the connection, even temporarily, Poland reminded everyone, China included, that no one can ignore its strategic position in Europe. Of course, that leverage comes with risk. The shutdown caused losses not only for China, but also for Polish businesses that depend on that same trade. Yet in moments of geopolitical tension, countries often choose security and political influence over short-term economics. And that's what Poland did. So while the drone incident and military drills were the visible sparks, the deeper fuel was political. A mix of NATO strategy, EU negotiations, and Poland's desire to assert itself as the key defender of Europe's eastern frontier. But what did this mean for trade on the ground? The political message may have been clear, yet the economic fallout was enormous. When Poland closed its border crossings, it wasn't just a political signal, it was an economic earthquake. In less than a week, 90% of all China-Europe freight trains came to a complete halt. That meant around 300 trains, carrying everything from clothing to high-tech equipment, were suddenly stranded on the Belarusian side with nowhere to go. Each of those trains can carry about 100 containers, and each container can be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Do the math. You're talking about billions of dollars worth of goods sitting still. Just counting e-commerce orders headed from China to Europe, the total value delayed was estimated at over $320 million. And those numbers don't even include industrial cargo like auto parts, photovoltaic panels, or precision machinery, which are all time-sensitive and critical for factories across Europe. Inside the European Union, supply chains started feeling the pressure fast. Assembly lines that rely on just-in-time deliveries, where parts arrive only when needed, had to slow down or pause altogether. It's like a car factory missing one tiny screw. Without it, the whole car can't be finished. Retailers waiting for new stock before the holiday season were forced to delay launches or pay extra to fly goods in by air. But the impact didn't stop at the border. Inside Poland, logistics centers built entirely around the China-Europe trade line went silent. The Milosevice terminal, usually buzzing with cranes, trucks, and customs officers, was suddenly quiet. The entire facility, capable of handling 350,000 containers a year, became almost idle. Local businesses paid the price immediately. More than 20 logistics companies in the area had to suspend operations, while warehouses sat full and unpaid workers were sent home. Economists estimated Poland was losing about $12 million per day in loading, storage, and customs activities alone. And the longer the border stayed closed, the worse the fear became. Shippers and investors began to wonder, if one political decision can shut down the main trade artery between China and Europe for weeks, could it happen again? Confidence, which is the invisible fuel of global trade, started to fade. It was a sharp reminder that modern supply chains are only as strong as their weakest link. One closed gate, one stalled train, and the ripple effects can spread across continents. Faced with that reality, China and its partners knew they couldn't afford to rely on a single route anymore. Within days, they started activating backup plans that had been quietly in development for years. While trains sat frozen at the Belarusian border, China didn't waste time waiting for the gates to reopen. The country had been preparing for this kind of crisis long before it happened. For years, Chinese planners and logistics companies had been working on alternative trade routes, backup corridors that could keep goods flowing even if the northern line through Poland was ever blocked. When the shutdown hit, those plans quickly turned into action. The first and fastest response came through what's known as the Middle Corridor, or the Trans-Caspian International Transport Route. Instead of going north through Russia and Belarus, this line cuts south, from China across Kazakhstan, over the Caspian Sea, through Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey, before entering Europe. It's like taking a detour through Central Asia and the Caucasus, but it keeps the goods moving. During the Polish blockade, China activated this route at full speed. At its peak, it was rerouting goods worth over $45 million per day. For a route that used to be considered secondary, that was a major breakthrough. In the first 3 quarters of 2025 alone, 229 trains traveled via the Middle Corridor, 28 times more than the previous year. This line now handles roughly 15% of all China-Europe freight, and China plans to boost its annual capacity to 10 million tons within the next 2 years. But China's backup strategy didn't stop there. The second plan was a bold one, the Arctic route. Through cooperation with Russia, China has been developing a shipping passage that runs across the Arctic Ocean. In September 2025, a test voyage set out from Ningbo port in China, passed Qingdao and Shanghai, and sailed north through icy waters to reach Felixstowe in the UK, before continuing to Rotterdam, Hamburg, and finally Gdansk in Poland. The whole journey took only 18 days, about half the time of the traditional sea route through the Suez Canal. For China, this new Arctic line isn't just a backup. It's a strategic game-changer that could reshape maritime logistics between Asia and Europe. The third route is still under construction, but it's perhaps the most ambitious of all, the China-Kyrgyzstan-Uzbekistan Railway. This project, often called the CKU Railway, will run 523 kilometers, connecting China's Xinjiang region directly through Central Asia, completely bypassing Russia and Poland. Once finished, it will shorten travel distances by about 900 kilometers, cut 7 to 8 days of transit time, and reduce logistics costs by over 30%. By 2031, when it's expected to be fully operational, this line could handle nearly 1/3 of all China-Europe freight. Together, these routes form a resilient triangle of trade north through Poland, south through the Middle Corridor, and by sea through the Arctic. It's China's way of making sure no single country can shut down the flow of commerce again, and the shift is already visible. Southern routes have seen freight volumes grow by 127% year-on-year, boosting their share from 18% to 31%, while Poland's share in the network is projected to drop by 15%. The message is clear. The world's most powerful supply chains are learning to adapt, and fast. When the Polish border reopened in late September 2025, trains began to roll again, but something had permanently changed. The shutdown lasted barely 2 weeks, yet its impact was long enough to redraw the mental map of Eurasian trade. Every country, every logistics firm, every policymaker had just been reminded how fragile the world's just-in-time economy really is. For China, the message was crystal clear: never depend on a single gatekeeper again. In the months that followed, Chinese logistics companies shifted investments southward, expanding the Middle Corridor and fast-tracking the new CKU railway. For Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Georgia, this was a golden opportunity. Once seen as landlocked and peripheral, they suddenly became central players in a new Silk Road 2.0, one that no longer relied solely on Europe's eastern frontier. Meanwhile, Poland's position began to look more complicated. For years, it was the undisputed hub of China-Europe trade, the place where everything passed through. That brought influence, jobs, and steady revenue. But after the closure, global investors started rethinking their plans. Some logistics companies began setting up alternative bases in Turkey, Kazakhstan, and even Finland, where new rail-sea links can bypass Belarus entirely. It's a classic case of short-term power versus long-term trust. By showing it could close the gate, Poland proved its strategic importance, but it also made partners worry it might do it again. And in trade, trust is everything. A route that's 1,000 kilometers longer but politically stable will always beat a shorter one that can be shut with a single decision. The European Union, too, took a hard look at itself. For years, the EU's trade strategy relied on stable borders and predictable politics. But as this crisis showed, economic geography and geopolitics are now impossible to separate. You can't talk about trains and trade without talking about security, alliances, and influence. Zoom out even further, and the story becomes bigger than Poland or China. It's about a global system in transition, one where trade routes are no longer just economic corridors, but also tools of diplomacy and defense. Every rail line, every port, every crossing is now part of a much larger contest for control and resilience. The border shutdown didn't just pause trade, it accelerated a shift that was already underway. The age of single-route dependence is over. The future belongs to networks that adapt, diversify, and survive shocks, whether they come from politics, war, or nature. So the next time a freight train leaves Chongqing bound for Europe, it might not go through Poland. It might pass through the Caucasus, skim the Arctic, or roll across the steppes of Central Asia. The destination hasn't changed, but the path and the power dynamics behind it definitely have. In the end, this isn't just a story about trains. It's a story about how interconnected the modern world really is, and how one border closure can remind us that even in a globalized century, the flow of goods and power still depends on a few crucial lines drawn on a map. When we step back and look at the full picture, this story isn't just about a border closure or a rerouted train line. It's about how fragile yet adaptable our global systems have become. The China-Europe Railway was built as a symbol of connection. Steel tracks linking two continents, turning distance into opportunity. But this event showed that even the strongest links can be tested by politics, conflict, or fear. The real lesson here is that connectivity isn't just about building infrastructure, it's about building resilience. You can lay thousands of kilometers of track, but if one country's decision can bring the whole system to a standstill, that's not true connectivity. True connectivity means having options, alternate routes, trusted partners, and flexibility when the unexpected happens. For China, the strategy now is clear: diversify or be dependent. The backup routes, the Arctic Corridor, the Middle Corridor, and the new CKU railway are not just Plan Bs. They're pieces of a much bigger vision to create a web of global transport lines so broad that no single shutdown, no single country can hold trade hostage again. For Europe, it's a moment of reflection too. The EU depends heavily on steady flows of imports and exports, from electronics to energy components. Events like this remind European policymakers that geography still matters, and that economic security can't exist without geopolitical foresight. And for the rest of the world, from Asia to Africa to the Americas, this is a warning wrapped in opportunity. Every time a global trade line is disrupted, new routes emerge elsewhere. Ports grow busier, regions once ignored gain attention, and old trade maps get redrawn. In a way, this is history repeating itself. 2,000 years ago, the ancient Silk Road also rose and fell depending on wars, alliances, and shifting powers. Today, the trains that echo that legacy face the same forces, just in modern form. Technology has changed, human nature hasn't. So, what does the future look like? Likely, more routes, more players, and more resilience. The world's supply chains will become less centralized, less fragile, and perhaps even fairer, spreading opportunity beyond traditional power centers. Because in the end, the global economy isn't a straight line between China and Europe. It's a living network, constantly adjusting, learning, and rerouting itself in response to a changing world. And that's the true spirit of the modern Silk Road. Not just connection, but adaptation. If you've made it this far, you can see how one decision, one border closure, can ripple across the globe. If you found this story insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep exploring how global events shape our everyday lives, from the prices on store shelves to the trains that carry them. Because the world is changing fast, and understanding how it connects is more important than ever.